Now that you know what's inside of cells, let's take a look at tissues and also cell junctions. The four primary tissue types are epithelium, connective tissue, muscle, and nerve. Muscle and nerve don't divide anymore, so we call them postmitotic. Epithelium and connective tissue, they still undergo mitosis. Okay, starting out with the extracellular matrix. So that would be the material that you find outside of cells, and that helps the cells to communicate with one another in the context of the tissue that they are in and to stay in place in that tissue where they're supposed to be. So this extracellular matrix material is synthesized and secreted by cells. A lot of it is glycoproteins. So we have something called the glycocalyx that also helps your immune system to identify whether the cell belongs to you or it's something foreign. So we have this carbohydrate kind of layer that's most of the extracellular matrix material. We also have some insoluble protein fibers, for example, collagen, laminin fibers, some other stuff, and then anchoring kind of mechanisms for communication and for staying in place in the tissue. So let's take a look at cell junctions. We have cell-to-cell junctions that are either for anchoring a cell to its neighbor or for communication. Now, a junction that's very important for physiology is called the gap junction. So the gap junction is a communicating junction. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Then we also have these junctions that are mostly, the purpose is to attach cells to one another. So there are tight junctions. They also prevent stuff from moving in a certain direction. So we saw earlier that these phospholipid bilayers, these lipid rafts that are traveling, and so sometimes we need to prevent a lipid raft from going in a certain area, and then you need a tight junction to it's sort of a barrier. The anchoring junctions, there we have these cell-cell junctions with cadherents, and then very important integrants. But these are not that important here for physiology. So here are some examples of major cell adhesion molecules, cadherents and integrants. They are important, but we won't talk much about it in this course. And then the immunoglobulin superfamily CAMs and selectants. So let's just sort of run through some of these. And here's sort of the summary slide here of cell junctions. Very important for physiology are these communicating junctions. I'm going to circle this. They're called gap junctions. Very important, for example, in the heart, and we will talk much more about it then. The protein family that makes these gap junctions, they're called connexins. So this is the connexin family of proteins. And then, of course, we have these occluding junctions that are sort of preventing stuff from traveling, like a lipid raft from traveling in an area that it's not supposed to be. We won't be talking too much about these. And then anchoring junctions, there's a variety of them. The integrin family of proteins is important on that end, and cadherents. But again, for physiology, make sure that you know about gap junctions and connexins. So here they are, and very cute. They are basically, so picture this, you have the phospholipid bilayer of one cell right here, and here's the other cell, the adjacent cell. And now we want to make sure that we're creating a pore. So where, let's say, an electric signal here in the heart, we're in the heart. So where an electric signal needs to travel very quickly from one cell to the next, so that you have a very that you have the ability of the heart muscle to contract as a whole organ. So you need to transfer the electric information very quickly from cell to cell so that the heart responds as a unit. And that's done by using gap junctions. So these connexin proteins, they need to be embedded into the phospholipid bilayer, and they need to perfectly line up. So these connections, or these connexin proteins, they need to perfectly line up. Do you see that? There's one embedded into this part of the phospholipid bilayer, and a perfect match up here on the other side of the other cells phospholipid bilayer. And the goal is that electric information can flux freely from one cell to the next without hindrance, without the need to fire another action potential or release neurotransmitters or something like that. So in the heart, that's a great place where we have lots and lots of gap junctions. They're in such high density that you can even see them in a light microscope, and they're known as intercalated discs, if you remember that from anatomy. Now here we have this is more a occluding a junction, so that if you want to sort of attach two cells very tightly to one another, so these tight junctions is a good example of this here. You can see this tight junction right here and what they look like. A lot of times it works kind of like cell Velcro. We have these proteins that will sort of almost have these like teeth that are interdigitating with one another, and that would be a great way to bind two cells to one another, make sure that they don't freely float apart. And okay, let's move on to epithelial tissue. The structure, hopefully you remember some of that from anatomy. It depends on how many layers you have, on whether they are ciliated or not. And so there's these rules in naming this epithelial tissue. I have no intention of repeating that with you guys. I just want to take a look at the different types of epithelial tissues. We have those that are just the lining of a surface of a body structure. And then we have secretory epithelium that secretes something, so like glands. Okay, so here would be a typical kind of epithelium that lines a body structure. So then it depends on the shape of the cells, whether they're box-shaped or they have this longitudinal kind of thing, and how many layers there are. So I hope that you remember some of this. The separation between epithelium and the connective tissue is called a basal lamina. So that's kind of important. So then we have the underlying connective tissue. And let's move on here. The layering. So hopefully you remember this from anatomy. If you have a simple epithelium, it's just one layer. If it's stratified, it's more than one layer. The shape could be squamous or flat, cuboidal, like a box, like a cube, and the columna is more box-shaped. And then the function for exchange, transport. We have the ciliated epithelium that can brush something in a certain direction, protective or secretory epithelium as well. And so here's a summary. This is more anatomy review, so hopefully you remember some of this, and we can just move on here. Let's take a look at more secretory epithelium. This would be glands that are secreting something. So these cells, they are classified as epithelium, but they're producing something that they then put somewhere. Let's say your pancreas produces lots of digestive enzymes, and then this pancreatic juice from these glands will be dumped into the small intestine. So, but this kind of stuff happens everywhere, and so it shows different kinds of epithelia here in this diagram. Okay, so here is an example of a flat epithelium. So these cells, this would be very nice for exchange, because you don't have to overcome a large distance. See how flat these cells are. They have not much of a distance here to go across. So here would be an exchange epithelium like you would find, let's say, maybe in the lungs, where you don't want to have a big diffusion space for oxygen and CO2 to travel. And then here would be your extracellular fluid, and then you have your epithelium right here. Maybe this is a capillary inside right here. Transport epithelium right here. This is something you would find in the small intestine or in the kidneys, where, let's say, let's use the kidneys as an example right now. You have the lumen of a renal tubule right here, and you need to reabsorb stuff. You want to reabsorb a lot of water, so you need to get the water and electrolytes and some other stuff that you want to reabsorb. You need to get it across the entire epithelium. So this is transepithelial transport. It's fairly complex, and we're going to add quite a few channels to this once we get to specifics in, let's say, our renal physiology lecture. But even for right now, it's kind of nice to see here some of the cellular structures that we've been talking about in action. You can see here a tight junction that prevents any of these proteins that are embedded in the membrane up here on the apical side here of this epithelium. You don't want them to just hitch a raft and just travel down here, see what's going on the other side of the cell. You want them to stay up here, and so you inserting here a tight junction on both sides, preventing these proteins from traveling past this point here. And same is true, of course, on the other side. These guys, they would be blocked from traveling from the basolateral side to the apical side of this epithelium. Anyway, much more on transport to come. This is just an initial view. So the transport epithelium characteristics, of course, the cell shape makes a difference. Flat cells are really good for minimizing diffusion distances. If you have a transport epithelium, that's kind of nice. And then cell junctions and cell organelles, so that are involved. Here's an example of a ciliated epithelium. You can take a look at that. And a respiratory tract, it's nice to trap dust particles that you then later cough out, so it's kind of nice. Here's a protective epithelium. Your skin is pretty nice, protecting you. It's waterproof too. The outer layers are keratinized so that they're waterproof. And here's a secretory epithelium where you have a goblet cell that's producing mucus, for example. Mucus. There's a scanning electron micrograph of a goblet cell. And continuing here with more secretory epithelium. A lot of these secretory epithelium is grouped in glands, and then we have two types of glands. Exocrine glands, they will release their products through a duct. So that means these cells are producing something and then they are delivering whatever they produced via a duct. Endocrine glands, they release their products directly into the blood. That's the big difference. So exocrine glands, they use a duct to deliver the materials, and endocrine, they release their stuff directly into the blood. Okay, so here, a little bit here about glands, glandular tissue. Here, the difference, let's focus on this one right here. Exocrine gland, we have a little duct. These are the cells that are producing something, and then we are delivering it via a duct. Endocrine cells, they release whatever they produce directly into the blood. So they use a little capillary here, and they dump their contents into the blood directly. Okay, continuing here with connective tissue. We have connective tissue always contains cells or cell bodies that are embedded in some sort of matrix material, some sort of a ground substance. And that ground substance, there's a lot of differences. Some is even liquid, like in the case of blood, or can be very hard in the case of bone, or elastic, as an elastic cartilage, for example. So we have cells, and they are embedded in this ground substance, which could be collagen, elastin, fibronectin, you name it, some other things too. So here's a little review of connective tissue. So we have cells that are embedded in matrix material. Let's use the example of blood cells. Of course, they're mobile. They are suspended in a liquid matrix material, which is plasma. And then we have fixed cells that are not able to move around so much. Like fibroblasts was a good example there. So here are some more added items here on the connective tissue. The ground substance is all sorts of different things. You can take a look at that. I'm sure you covered that in anatomy. It could be protein fibers that give a little bit more elasticity, give the ground substance their properties. And another review slide here of types of connective tissues that you can take a look at yourself. Use it for study purposes. Here's some images of different types of connective tissue. Here you have loose connective tissue, and then we also have dense connective tissue such as tendons and ligaments. And here will be an example of dense irregular connective tissue. So there's lots of collagen fibers that give a tendon its strength. And supportive connective tissue, cartilage, can be flexible It usually doesn't have any blood supply, so think of cartilage that you have in your nose, the ears, and the trachea, for example. And then bone, of course, gives you a lot of strength, but it has also this rigidity to it. It will be bone as a type of connective tissue, and cartilage right here, sort of cushion the ends of bones in a joint. And then here, there we have this would be a picture of bone over here. So the matrix material that's calcified is very hard and not flexible at all. Additional connective tissues would be adipose tissue, and we already mentioned blood, which is the only type of liquid connective tissue that we have, where the plasma is the matrix material. As an example of adipose tissue, lots of fat droplets inside there in these cells. And then here's blood. We have the blood cells suspended in a liquid matrix material, and that liquid matrix material is plasma. And now moving on to the types of tissues that are postmitotic, that can't divide anymore. That will be muscle and nerve. So we'll start here with muscle. Muscle tissue is excitable. That means it can respond to action potentials and release of neurotransmitters that it receives. It is contractile. You can move with muscle, and there are 3 types of muscle tissues: cardiac, smooth, and skeletal muscle. And you will hear lots and lots about all 3 of these muscle types when we get to the muscle lecture. So this is just an overview. And here's some skeletal muscle in a slide. I'm sure you remember that from anatomy. And here would be cardiac muscle in a slide. Still has the striations, but much smaller cells. And you can see here these intercalated discs that we talked about earlier. Those are the gap junction channels that are providing this juncture between one myocardial cell to the next. And they're very important that we have this perfect lineup. So the gap junctions are communicating junction, and you have such high concentration of those gap junction channels in the heart that you can literally see it as these darkened lines, sort of concentrated gap junctions that are forming these lines that we call intercalated discs. Now, smooth muscle, this is what it looks like. No more striations that are visible. Cells are pretty small. You see that in all tubular structures, like the intestines, your blood vessels. You have a lot of smooth muscles, all this more tubular structures. Now moving on to nervous tissue, the cells that are doing the job of the nervous system will be the neurons. Those are the nerve cells, and they're also postmitotic. They are staying in place for life. If you lose them, you can't replace them. That's something to think about. They are excitable, just like muscle cells. They can transmit and receive action potentials, which we will hear plenty about. And they have a support staff, which is kind of nice. And the ratio of support staff to neurons is about 10:1. So every neuron has about 10 glial cells that are supporting that one neuron. It's kind of nice to have that kind of a staff. And here would be a typical motor neuron shape. So you have the dendrites, these small input areas. These are shorter cell extensions, and then an axon here that's myelinated. And then here a connection, a synapse to the next neuron right there. And we will review this, of course, a lot more when we get to the nervous system. So this is just an overview. And here your summary table of the 4 tissue types: epithelium, connective tissue, muscle, and nerve. And you can read through that. I don't need to read that to you. So a little bit here on tissue remodeling to finish up. Cell death sometimes it's part of life to have cell death, especially when it comes to apoptosis. It's more like a tissue remodeling kind of mechanisms. Think about it. When an embryo forms first, and then you want to form all the body parts. Look at your fingers. There are no tissues between your fingers. We don't have webbed feet or hands. And so what happened to these cells once they were no longer needed in order to form your digits, your fingers, cells had to go, and that was by programmed cell death. So these cells, they were no longer needed in order to form these shapes of fingers. These webs of cells, they have to be removed, and that happens by apoptosis. necrosis, that is more tissue solubilization, and that's usually due to injury or something that happened to the cells that caused it to die. Stem cells are cells that are sort of a regeneration of tissues. I wish we could do more like these lizards. You step on their tail and you just grow a new one. You drop it and just grow a new one, and whole new organ. We can't do that, but we do still have stem cells in most tissues. An embryo has totipotent stem cells. They can grow into any tissue. Pluripotent is a little bit more limited. Multipotent, even more limited, but they're still stem cells that can regenerate tissues. And now finally organs. So organs are composed of a variety of tissues. So it's a group of tissues with related function. That's sort of the definition of an organ. And we can take a look at the skin as an example of an organ. You can see how there's, what is this muscle slide doing in here? Sorry, that wasn't meant to be here. Let's take a look at skin as an organ. And you can see we have adipose tissue right here. Then we have some blood vessels going through there. We have a hair that's the root is embedded right here. And then of course we have the epithelium. We have keratin layer on top to waterproof your skin. So you can see there's a variety. There's a little sweat gland right there, and you can see there's a variety of tissues that come together to provide the function that we need the skin to have. Yeah, another look at the epidermis. So you have a variety of cells in here. And you can see how they're connected to one another. And here, the connection between epidermis and dermis. You have this basal lamina, and it's kind of an important thing. So here we always have the separation between epithelium and connective tissue, and that's this basal lamina. That's this layer right here. You can see how these cells are connected to one another, so they're not just free floating, and we have this sort of random distribution of cells. Everything is very organized in the human body, and these cells, they need to be connected to one another, and they need to communicate with one another, and they're not allowed to break through the basal membrane, this basal lamina here, otherwise there would be cancer cells. Anyway, that's all I have for this lecture here. So for the cell sort of overview lecture, we will be talking about a variety of the things that we talked in this lecture in various other lectures where they will be provided in much more detail. So this is just an overview over the cell organelles and the types of tissues and cell junctions that we find in the human body.